continues with a look at aviation firsts, trailblazers.
May the 20th, 1927. A young American flyer sets out on a journey that will shrink the world.
Where? Contact. Contact.
In his aircraft, Spirit of St. Louis, Charles Lindbergh will be the first man to fly the Atlantic solo and become one of aviation's greatest trailblazers.
Nose wheel well up, smooth rotation continuing. Nose come up to 20 degrees, she's airborne. She flies.
April 1969. Another trailblazing flight. This time it's the world's first supersonic airliner, the Anglo-French Concorde. Lindbergh had taken 33.5 hours to cross the Atlantic. Concorde would soon be offering a regular service that took less than 3. The ultimate earth shrinker.
Aviation has shrunk the world to livable size, and it's made one community of the world. It's changed our whole manner of thinking and living on this little globe. I think in my wildest dreams I never anticipated how far and how fast we would go.
Exactly 50 years separated Concorde's maiden flight and the very first direct crossing of the Atlantic in a converted Vickers Bimini bomber. 1919 was the year that aviation trailblazing took off. With the First World War over, there were tens of thousands of planes looking for something to do. For the first time, countries could be linked and oceans crossed. The skies of the world cried out to be conquered. Indeed, the challenge had been thrown down 6 years earlier by the Daily Mail of London. A 10,000-pound prize for the first non-stop crossing of the Atlantic. In June 1919, 2 Royal Air Force pilots, John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown, arrived in Newfoundland to attempt the 2,000-mile flight to Ireland. Their Vickers Vimy had arrived in crates from England and was assembled on site. Meanwhile, another attempt was underway. 3 Curtiss flying boats of the U.S. Navy set out from Newfoundland to cross the Atlantic in stages. First stop was the Azores to refuel. 2 aircraft failed to get there, though their crews were saved. The third, flown by Lieutenant Commander Reed with a crew of 5, made it and went on via Lisbon to reach Plymouth. Their journey, the first flight of any kind across the Atlantic, had taken 15 days. Back in North America, no less than 12 different aircraft were trying for the 10,000-pound prize. By June 14th, the Vimy of Alcock and Brown was ready for takeoff from the grass strip of St. John's. Groaning with 870 gallons of fuel it needed for the flight, the Vimy slowly took off and headed east at a height of 1,200 feet. Overnight, the 2 pilots battled with fog banks, storms, ice, and dense cloud, while the world waited for news. After 16 hours, they finally reached the coast of Ireland and landed in a bog. An unceremonious end to a great adventure. But both men became instant heroes, claimed their prize, and were knighted. The first non-stop crossing of the Atlantic in 1919 was just one of the many trailblazing achievements of that remarkable year. In November, 2 Australian brothers, Ross and Keith Smith, returning from Europe after the war, took up another challenge. The Australian government had offered £10,000 for the first flight from London to Australia in under 30 days. After an eventful journey of 11,500 miles, the Smiths landed in Darwin with 2 days to spare. Behind such flights was the prospect of commercial aviation. It would be many years before such long distances could be flown by fare-paying passengers. But over shorter distances, commercial flights were already underway. The first international service began between Paris and Brussels in converted French bombers. But it was not a daily service. That began on April 25th, 1919, between London and Paris. It cost £21 and took 2.5 hours. Within a few years, Airlines were opening up all over Europe. Other ways were being devised for ex-wartime pilots to show off their skills.
Some of them had the idea of using surplus planes for circuses, flying circuses. Some went around barnstorming to give people 5-minute flights. It was all very novel, but disorganized.
One of the most popular barnstorming aircraft in the United States was the Curtiss Jenny.
A Jenny was a good airplane. You could maneuver that Jenny just anyway and get away with it. I mean, you'd spin it, stall it, side slip it into a field or anything you wanted to do. It was a nice loop, and it was a great, great airplane for its day. It was easy to handle, no hard work.
In Britain, throughout the 1920s, the showmanship of Alan Cobham's flying circus thrilled the crowds. Behind the stunts was a serious purpose, to sell the potential of flying to young and old alike. There were, of course, still plenty of trailblazing routes to conquer, including the ultimate challenge, a flight around the Earth. 26,000 miles over oceans, deserts, mountains, and jungles. In 1924, a group of United States Army Corps flyers assembled in Seattle, on America's west coast, to attempt the epic journey. 4 aircraft, Douglas World Cruisers, adaptable to wheels or floats, set off in April. They headed north to Alaska, where the lead aircraft crashed on a mountain, though the 2 crew were unhurt. The others flew on, along the Aleutian Island chain to Japan, moving in short hops across Asia, through Europe, and to Britain. Wherever they stopped along the way, presidents, politicians, and public all flocked to see the intrepid aviators and their flying machines. In the north of Scotland, they changed back to floats for the final challenge, the Atlantic crossing by way of Iceland, and then on to Newfoundland and Labrador. On the first Atlantic leg, another cruiser crashed, but its crew was rescued. The 2 surviving crews clambered ashore onto American soil to a warm welcome. But this was small compared to the greetings they were to receive on their journey across the United States, culminating in a tremendous reception at Seattle, where their adventure began. They had completed the first circumnavigation of the world by air. It had taken 175 days. Behind these trailblazing achievements came the commercial spin-offs. The United States Post Office soon saw the potential of an airmail, and services between cities sprang up all over the country. To start with, it was the pilots of the Army Air Corps who flew the mail. But soon private companies began to compete for post office contracts. A new hero now entered the public imagination, the mail pilot, whose exploits fired the enthusiasm of a younger generation of flyers.
Well, as a boy 11 years old, working at Sid Chaplin Aerodrome, South Hollywood, going out to the field after school on our bicycles, my brother and I, we got acquainted with some of the pilots. And so from then, we kept working around the airport. My idea was to fly the mail because I could fly, and I'd hear these stories about these intrepid mail pilots on the Midwest from Omaha to San Francisco and going across to Washington. This is before passenger lines were flying, and before Lindbergh flew to Paris. I couldn't wait to get back and start flying the mail. looking out from 1,500 feet high and doing 80 miles an hour, the fastest we'd ever been, and hearing the wind whistling and so forth, and smelling even some of the gas fumes coming back and watching those rocker arms on the front of the engine. From then on, that was it. We had finally reached a point where when we knew we were going to stay in these airplanes, that was all there was to it. And it was, it's been so many years ago. It's been 60-something years ago.
Before the coming of the airmail, it took almost a week for a letter to cross the country. Once regular transcontinental mail flights were inaugurated, it took just 2 days.
The early mail pilots were he-men. They were rough and ready, but lovable fellows who were in the thing because it was a new and dangerous business. Before the navigation aids had been installed, they had to learn their route like a book. Every hill, tree, and river, and village, to guide themselves in all kinds of weather.
It'll be a beautiful day, no passengers, no nothing else but just you and the mail and God. You'd get down, you'd fly low, and I'd say, gee, what day is this? I'm enjoying flying, and oh yeah, there's Miss Fuller's farmhouse. I used to see it from 6,000 feet. I'm right down over the top, go by, and they'd be out waving, and the laundry would be out hanging on the line. I'd say, hey, gee, yeah, that must be Monday. Monday's wash day.
I used to drop a newspaper off to my sister. She lived on a farm right on the route between Iowa City and Chicago. And I used to drop her a newspaper every time I fly over. Today, you'd be 5 or 6 miles up in the air, and if you dropped a newspaper, it'd probably land in England. You couldn't do that today.
As time went on, we acquired more knowledge. There was primitive flying. We'd push our luck sometimes in order to make a good point for the company that had the contract mail carriers. So there were many flights. I look back at them now that I feel a little bit fortunate that I'm here.
It was subsidies from the post office that launched and sustained the airmail. In time, these subsidies led to corruption and scandal. But without them, the U.S. airmail would never have kept flying. In Britain, it was the vast size of its empire that attracted the trailblazer. In 1925, Alan Cobham set off from Croydon near London on a long-distance flight to survey potential routes for the recently formed Imperial Airways. His destination, Cape Town, an 8,000-mile journey down the length of Africa. His companions, a film cameraman and a mechanic.
One had no meteorological reports. They couldn't even telephone up ahead to find out what it was like. So you flying into the unknown as far as weather was concerned. You might meet low cloud, you might meet a snowstorm, you might meet a dust storm, but you never knew what was ahead of you.
One is amazed how on earth he ever found these strips, which the local men had cleared in the jungle, but find them he did with a compass. No radar or any of those fancy things, a straightforward compass, and you just steered by looking over the top of the compass and said it must be about there. And somehow or other you found it and landed on this strip. And there, this local commissioner would meet you, and there would be men posted about the airplane. I mean, animals really was what you were protecting the airplane from, in case they did any damage to it while it stayed there overnight. The organization that must have gone into these trips is interesting. The trip round Africa would have involved fantastic transportation problems. Cans of petrol have to be there waiting. you have to have made arrangements for that fuel to have been ferried up there, possibly by canoe and so on. The local natives come out to actually beat the land down with their feet and make the runway firm enough for father to be able to take off. Because you can see before they do this, there's one wheel sunk in the mud, and clearly he would not be able to get off at all. Thousands of people turn out and welcome this pioneer from England. I should think some of them thought, this madman from England, and if you look at the country that had been traversed, you're inclined to agree with some of them as well.
London to Cape Town in 3 months. One of Cobham's many trailblazing flights across the British Empire.
By that method, he really opened the Empire Airlines step by step, long before there were airlines capable of doing it. These flights had tremendous publicity. The newspapers of England and often of many other places in the world publicized the story, building him up as a great man, and people were enormously interested. He was the pop idol of the day.
Cobham might have convinced the public with his epic flights, but he still had to persuade the British government. To win them over, when he flew back from Australia, he took his case straight to Parliament by landing on the Thames at Westminster.
Lord Birkenhead replied, you see, after I'd given my impassioned speech on having an air route to India immediately. And he said, the present moment when I send a dispatch to India, I say, thank God I can't get a reply under 2 months. Now Cobham is going to have a reply in a week. Life will be unbearable. We don't want airlines.
For the determined aviator, the world still abounded in challenges. The aim of American explorer Commander Richard Byrd was to fly over the South Pole. From the start, appalling conditions delayed the attempt. The crew had to spend the winter in the Antarctic. Byrd's aircraft was a Ford Tri-Motor, and to protect it from the intense cold, the team had to improvise an unusual hangar. Three years earlier, Byrd had successfully overflown the North Pole. Now he and his companions spent the dark winter months of 1929 holed up in their base camp, preparing for their attempt on the South Pole. Spring arrived at last, and with it, suitable weather. The first task was to dig out the Tri-Motor and see if it had survived its hibernation. On November 28th, the Tri-Motor, named the Floyd Bennett after Byrd's companion on his North Pole flight, took off with its crew of 4. Ahead lay a round trip of 1,600 miles, and little chance of rescue if they had to come down on the way. Fuel started to look dangerously low, so the crew threw out everything they could spare to light the airplane. At last, almost 10 hours into the flight, Commander Byrd reached 90 degrees south, the first man to fly over both poles. In the Himalayas, aviators found another challenge: Everest, the world's highest peak. In 1933, a British team led by the Marquis of Clydesdale arrived on the northern plains of India, determined to be the first to fly over the 29,000-foot summit. They had to wait for months for the right weather conditions. Storm clouds and strong winds over the mountains delayed the attempt.
Very few people had been over 30,000 feet, but there was worldwide interest in achieving the height record, and to that end the French had had a stab at it, the Italians had held the record, and recently the Americans. So high flying was a fairly unknown subject. Very special suits of 4-ply material were constructed and fitted with a very elaborate system of heating elements throughout, including boots and flying helmets. That in turn required large electric power, and therefore big generators had to be fitted to the machine. The helmets were similarly heated, and even the goggles and a face mask had their electrical elements.
The teams were also experimenting with cameras and film at low temperatures and great altitude.
The observer on it was taking pictures, and each time he changed a plate, he had to go back into the cockpit. And on one of these occasions, he trod on his flexible metal oxygen pipe. And then when he stood up, the pipe parted company.
Without oxygen at that height, Bonnet would not have survived. But quick thinking on his part saved him, and the planes went on to fly over the summit.
He'd been working with his camera for a little bit longer, and then he began to pass out, and did eventually collapse completely into the bottom of the cockpit. The pilot couldn't do anything about this because there was the two separate cockpits.
The flight was a success, but as the cameraman had passed out, both aircraft flew the mission again 3 days later so their achievement could be properly filmed. Adventures like these captured the headlines. More significant for commercial aviation was the challenge to fly non-stop between the cities of New York and Paris, a competition that reached its peak some years earlier at a tragic cost. In 1926, French aviator René Fonck and his crew were ready to try for the $25,000 Ortig prize, offered for the first successful crossing. The problem all these Atlantic challengers faced was the weight of the fuel that they had to carry. The critical moment was takeoff, when the load was heaviest. In the flames that engulfed Fonck's Sikorsky aircraft, 2 of his 5-man crew died. Undeterred, a queue of contenders joined the race to cross the Atlantic. Clarence Chamberlain and Lloyd Berthoud began in style, but saw their hopes fall flat when their landing gear broke on a test flight. Commander Byrd was also among the hopefuls. An unfortunate landing postponed his challenge. American pilots Davis and Wooster were preparing for their attempt. On the final test, their tanks heavy with fuel, the aircraft became difficult to control. Soon after takeoff, it plunged into the ground. Both men were killed. From Europe came an attempt in the reverse direction, against the prevailing winds. French ace Charles Nougesor and his co-pilot Francois Colly set off from Le Bourget near Paris, heading west over the Atlantic. The aircraft named the White Bird and its 2 pilots were never seen again. Enter the next challenger, a converted Ryan aircraft named Spirit of St. Louis. 25-year-old Charles Lindbergh had persuaded some St. Louis businessmen to sponsor his bid. On May 20th, 1927, he was ready for the challenge that had cost so many lives.
Lindbergh was a dreamer. Certainly as an airman pilot, he had as much experience at flying without great assistance from aides on the ground. And so he couldn't resist the opportunity to participate in the race. He was not an extrovert. He was a very conservative character, but not too conservative to try to get in the Atlantic.
Lindbergh would have to fly the journey blind, relying on a periscope or leaning out of the window to see what lay ahead. An extra-large fuel tank had been fitted directly in front of the cockpit between the wings for the best center of gravity. It completely cut off the view forward.
Brakes in contact.
Today, Lindbergh's spirit is not forgotten. Piloted by enthusiasts, this replica flies regularly. And Lindbergh's own experience of the epic adventure lives on in his writings.
What a beautiful machine it is. In front of the hangar, trim and slender, gleaming in its silver coat. All our ideas, all our calculations, all our hopes lie there before me, waiting to undergo the acid test of flight. For me, it seems to contain the whole future of aviation. When such planes can be built, there's no limitation to the air. My cockpit quivers with the engine's tenseness. Sharp explosions from the exhaust stacks speak with confidence and precision. But the spirit of St. Louis isn't vibrant with power as it's always been before. I'm conscious of the great weight pressing tires into the ground, of the fragility of wings, of the fullness of oversized tanks of fuel. There is in my plane this morning more of earth and less of air than I've ever felt before. I'm alone at last, over the first short stretch of sea on the route to France. The surface is calm. There's hardly a sign of movement beneath the oil-smooth sheen of its skin. It's only 35 miles to the Connecticut shore, but I've never flown across that much water before. I relax in my cockpit, this little box with fabric walls in which I'm to ride across the ocean. Now, if all goes well, I won't move from it for a day and a half until I step out on French sod at the airport of Le Bourget. There's room enough, no more, no less. My cockpit's been tailored to me like a suit of clothes. Instrument readings are all normal. The engine sounds smoother than at the beginning of the flight. Possibly it's simply the smoothness a well-cared-for engine gains during the early hours of its life. Whatever the cause, there's something in its rhythm that assures me and gives me confidence with which to enter the unknown space ahead, to climb up over the fog, over the sea, and into the night. It seems impossible to go on longer. All I want in life is to throw myself down flat, stretch out, and sleep. I've got to find some way to keep alert. There's no alternative but death and failure. No alternative but death and failure, I keep repeating, using the thought as a whip on my lagging mind, trying to make my senses realize the importance of what I'm saying.
After 33.5 hours, the Spirit of St. Louis reached Paris.
It's only 100 yards to the hangars now. It would be better to come in straight, but if I don't side-slip, I'll be too high over the boundary to touch my wheels in the area of light. Not a bad landing. I start to taxi back toward the floodlights and hangars, but the entire field ahead is covered with running figures.
It seemed as if all Paris had turned out to greet him. With one flight, he had become a legend, joining the select group of aviation's pioneers, like Louis Blériot. On his return to America, his reception was no less triumphant. Everywhere he went, he drew an ecstatic welcome.
Lindbergh became the symbol of flight. And he was young, he was handsome, and he was taciturn, and he was a kind of an ideal hero. Lindbergh captured the imagination of the world. He was dedicated to the gospel of flight, and it was all really to publicize flight. After all, if you become a god, you want your parishioners to keep on with the incense, if nothing else.
Lindbergh's flight fired an explosion of interest in commercial aviation.
Prime.
Center engine primed.
Ready to start center engine.
Clear center engine.
The Ford Tri-Motor, America's first purpose-built airliner, was ready to exploit the public interest.
It was built as a very sturdy plane, and it's still flying, some of them. It shows how very over-strong it had been built, because they didn't know what to expect. The Ford Motor Company had been interested in aviation by Bill Stout, who had built a single-engine plane, but Mr. Ford felt he wanted more safety, and so we developed the Ford Tri-Motor plane.
So strongly built was the Tri-Motor, it could even loop the loop. Henry Ford set up a small production line in part of his giant Detroit car factory to build Tri-Motors.
We had 2 or 3 aeronautical engineers that came to the Ford Motor Company and supervised the construction of it. It was much more of a hand-built affair. And there weren't so very many of them built, you know, altogether. I think it was one of the very first all-metal planes with an enclosed cabin for the pilots, and wheel on at the rear in place of a tail skid, and brakes so that it could operate more like an automobile in that sense. The corrugations were built so they ran in the direction of the wind. And this, we had quite an argument in Europe over this question, because the Europeans claimed they had a patent on corrugations that ran in the same direction as the wind, which seemed too silly for words. Well, it was nothing like a modern plane. It was heavy. Sometimes you needed help from the co-pilot to handle it in rough weather. It had an excellent wing profile that gave it a good lift.
In 1928, to fly to the West Coast, passengers from New York first had to take the train to Columbus, Ohio. There, they boarded the Tri-Motor of TAT Airlines, which took them by stages to Los Angeles, including an overnight stop. One of the airline's executives was Eugene Vidal. His son, Gore Vidal, the writer, was the first child to fly across America.
When you look back on it, I mean, they were sublimely uncomfortable. Not as uncomfortable as air travel now, naturally. First of all, you always had a container beside your seat, which you were to vomit. And the passengers would just go like that and then go on talking. The planes are going like that. And then, and I've never seen a description of this overwhelming smell of burning petrol. I mean, you really were almost asphyxiated at times because they hadn't worked out how to air condition these things. My father decided to serve lunch. It was the first time a meal had ever been served on an airplane. And my mother, who was very grand and always on a diet, said, oh, everybody loves consommé. Well, the first group from Washington, New York, who had the consommé were scalded to death. In those days, we were not so litigious, so there were no lawsuits. And after that, my father decreed hard-boiled eggs, the only thing they would serve. And coffee, but at your peril, it was always tepid.
For all the discomfort these early passengers experienced, they had the first memorable opportunity to see from the air the grandeur of the American continent. Their journey ended at Burbank Airport in Los Angeles.
We went down so fast that both of my eardrums were cracked. And so, screaming up a storm, I'm taken off the plane with blood trickling down my tiny lobes. My father, the manager of the airline, said, you loved that flight, didn't you, my boy? First child to have flown across the country is shrieking up a storm. I'm just going like this at him, you know, and the blood streaming down the ears. That is my memory of the first year of transcontinental flight.
Some early entrepreneurs realized that the new airliners offered other business opportunities.
I formed a company called Scenic Airways and bought 2 of the Ford Tri-Motors and flew them out to the Grand Canyon for sightseeing service, which is still the oldest sightseeing service in operation. The first time I flew over the canyon, it's almost indescribable, but it's almost a religious feeling you get as you pass over the rim, and then the ground suddenly opens up below you and you see this wonderful expanse of colored rock with the tiny river down at its base.
When Lindbergh flew the Atlantic, there was no organized air passenger service in the United States. Within a year, 60,000 people were being carried by the new airlines. 2 years later, the figure had reached 250,000. Lindbergh had rung in the dawn of a new age of commercial aviation. In many ways, the Europeans had been more farsighted. Germany, prevented after the war from having an air force, poured its resources into a state airline, Lufthansa. It had regular flights all over Europe, carrying tens of thousands of passengers, long before Lindbergh woke up America to air transport. An airmail service to the outposts of empire was what Britain wanted. And the airline charged with the task of carrying it was the government-backed Imperial Airways. It took passengers too, though not as many as Lufthansa. Luxury was what Imperial offered. And by the 1930s, it had the aircraft to provide it. The Handley Page 42.
Nothing will ever come up to that feeling as I stepped aboard that aircraft for the first time, to see this great lumbering giant as it looked then, a cockpit that looked like a greenhouse stuck on the front, all perspex. It was known as the Flying Orange Box, of course, because of the tail formation. The only people that could afford to fly were government officials whose fare was paid, and of course the very wealthy, whose privilege was to fly around the world wherever they chose to go. And it was our job to make that flight as pleasant and as comfortable and as easygoing as possible. Whatever their want, we were expected to supply it.
The HP-42 had to land very frequently to refuel because headwinds cut our ground speed to 30 or 40 miles per hour. It sounds quite remarkable, but we frequently dropped down to those speeds, crossing the desert. We stopped, for example, at Sharjah, which was a fascinating place. To land there on a patch of sand and taxi up to this very solid fort was quite an experience.
Abbas Khan. 6 Saabs coming tonight.
Right.
I'll come and inspect the rooms in half an hour.
Right.
Airplane coming 5:30.
Both at Chatham.
Net! Surface wind and barometric pressure, please.
Right. Surface wind northwest 8 miles. Barometric pressure 10.2.
Wind northwest 8 miles.
In America, the priority of the independent airlines was the growing domestic market. But before long, a new company, Pan American Airways System, saw the attractions of an international airmail and passenger service. The airline was the creation of a far-seeing, if ruthless man, named Juan Trippe.
The way in which this force, air transportation, is used will have a tremendous bearing on the future of mankind.
Trippe's first goal was a network of routes from the United States to the Caribbean and Central America. He soon realized that the seaplane was the ideal aircraft for his plans. Few of the countries on his intended routes had airfields, but a seaplane could land in harbors, rivers, and lakes, thus opening up most major cities in South America to his operations. Trippe, however, had even wider ambitions for his tiny airline.
When he offered me the job, I told him, I said, Vaughn, you don't have enough work for me to do. You only have 2 airplanes. And he said, oh, he said, but we're going to have a fleet of airplanes. He said, we're going down to South America. He said, we're going over to Europe, and we're going to cross the Pacific. I said, it's amazing. He said, well, we're going to do it.
Tripp set about establishing a network of routes with ruthless efficiency. He started by winning the first 2 airmail contracts to Panama and the Windward Islands. By cultivating foreign governments, he then shut out his rivals and established an effective monopoly on the routes. This pattern was repeated wherever he opened a service. He was accused of corruption with foreign officials and collusion with the U.S. Post Office. But soon Pan Am was booming. Indeed, in some people's eyes, was almost an extension of U.S. foreign policy.
Vaughn Tripp wanted to be the czar of air transportation. He wanted to have the U.S. premier airline. He didn't want competition at all. He wanted to be the international representative of the country. A ruthless man, of course, as I guess sometimes you have to be. But I had great admiration for his ability and for the wonderful dreams he had and his ability to bring them into operation.
This latest clipper will be christened the Brazilian clipper by Madame Vargas, wife of the President of Brazil, and will be placed in service on the East Coast trade route between the United States, Brazil, and the Argentine.
Tripp took every opportunity to keep Pan Am in the public eye. He hired Charles Lindbergh to survey and open up new routes, exploiting Lindbergh's skill as a pilot and his fame. And nothing guaranteed press or public attention more than the prospect of Lindbergh inaugurating a new service. Pan Am's fleet of aircraft grew, and so did Tripp's ambitions. He saw the lucrative potential of routes across the Atlantic and the Pacific. With the giant seaplane, the S-42, Tripp first planned an Atlantic service. But when the British, who had no aircraft that could carry passengers across the Atlantic, refused him landing rights, he turned instead to the Pacific. Pan Am began the immense task of building a chain of airports on remote islands and atolls across the great ocean. Lagoons had to be dynamited to clear coral reefs, hotels and workshops built, fuel dumps constructed. The first stage, from Alameda in California to Hawaii, was the longest, 2,400 miles. In April 1935, test pilot Captain Eddie Musick made the first proving flight. It took almost 18 hours. The trip back took 2 hours longer.
They just barely made it back. There were only 72 gallons of gas left in the tanks. Captain Musick was supposed to do his triumphant circle over the city, and he said, hell with that. He came in and landed straight in.
In 1937, the British finally had a seaplane they felt capable of crossing the Atlantic, the C-class Empire flying boat. So they struck a two-way deal with Pan Am. On July the 5th, a Pan Am S-42 flying boat left LaGuardia, New York, to fly to Southampton. At exactly the same time, a C-class Empire flying boat of Imperial Airways took off from Southampton Water, bound for New York. Both survey flights were a success. But to achieve it, the British had stripped out all interior fittings to give their plane enough range. And their Pan Am rival had installed extra fuel tanks inside the cabin. Both were operating at the limits of technology. No airline yet had an aircraft capable of carrying passengers across the Great Divide. It would be another 2 years before an aircraft would come into operation that could comfortably cross the Atlantic. Pan Am's Boeing Clipper could carry 72 passengers and plenty of freight. But 3 months after it came into service, Britain was at war. By the time the conflict ended, and the Atlantic was once more open to commercial operations, the days of the great flying boats were over.